jump into the meeting. I think we're a minute early, but yeah. So we are a minute early, and so this is actually a joint work session. It is not a deliberation, however, but because it is an official meeting, we have to make note of both the Planning Commission and City Council members that are here, and we're going to kind of cut to the chase and basically say who's not here. So.
The councilors that are not here are Councilor Anderson and Councilor Herrera, and the commissioners that are not here are Commissioner de Blasi and Commissioner Wilson.
So, first of all, let me just say thank you for taking time out of your schedules. You know what? This is a city of volunteers. Obviously, the council and the planning commission are volunteers, but you're all volunteers as well. You all dedicate your time, and the conversation that we're having tonight is part of an important conversation that we need to have, that the council needs to hear, and these are the decisions that we are going to be making regarding our growth boundary. And it is no secret that growth is a big topic. Currently, the economy is strong, and we have a lot of building permits that are being issued. We have a limited land supply, and just for the record, Councilor de Blasi has come, and there he is in the back. So this discussion about growth has always been something that has been is part of Keizer's discussion. As you know, we share an urban growth boundary. We are the only ones that share an urban growth boundary in the state. So since Springfield and Eugene got their divorce, that was actually something they had to do at the legislature. It is a little less clear what our path is here in the city of Keizer, but certainly it is on the minds of everybody. And as we continue to grow within the boundary, then there's that much more pressure on our facilities and how we're going to meet our land supply into the future. Currently, with a shared urban growth boundary, we legally meet our land supply. But is that the course we want to take? And what are the issues? And so we are the beneficiaries of a transportation growth management grant, education and outreach program. And tonight is that education outreach grant process. Our consultants are from OTAC, and they are Glenn, Kate Rogers, and then Evan Manville is the education outreach. I'm not sure exactly what your title is. Coordinator. There you go. So tonight we are basically going to have some presentation material here. They will break at appropriate times, and they will then ask for your questions. Now, obviously, this is not the whole scope. This isn't, well, I'll let them explain. But so how it would work then, because of the televised audience kind of situation, if you will raise your hand and ask your question, Glenn or Kate will reiterate your question for the viewing audience. So we expect to go for 90 minutes, and we will be punctual. The council actually has a special meeting after that. So with that in mind, again, thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to Glenn.
Thank you, Nate. So as Nate said, I'm a planner with OTAC. With questions, I will reiterate, there's a lot of depth in any one of the topics we're going to cover. So I'm going to go over several things. If we want to delve deeper into something, that's what the question and answer periods are going to be for. Hopefully it's a conversation, not just a Q&A. So the presentation is going to go as follows. I'm going to twist a little bit like that. The presentation goes as follows. We've been doing research, both from previous projects, looking at literature reviews that are out there. We're going to give you some conclusions there on what people determine as the cost of growth. So what is happening to us from a budget standpoint, from a community character standpoint, as we grow in any direction, infill, urban growth boundaries, et cetera. We're going to look at some other jurisdictions and see what's worked, what hasn't worked within Oregon. And then kind of bring us back and say, you know, how does this fit with Keizer? How does it help us inform where we want to be heading and where we want to research next, and what's available. So Nate stole a couple of my thoughts, so I'll just kind of go with them. But, you know, yes, city's been growing, fairly consistent with with other parts of the Mid-Valley, about a 6% in the last 8 years. The city's vacant land supply, which is the kind of the most typical when you look at development, that's the land that's getting used most often, it has gotten smaller. There are fewer and fewer fully vacant parcels. There are some parcels that definitely have building capacity, but they have some homes on them. So there's one up there by the roundabout, some good examples of that. So the ability for the status quo of single-family home and apartment development on vacant land is getting a little harder every day. So if we look at how the city's been growing this is a 16-year period, you can see from the colors here that the image on your left is 2000, then we go to 2016. With just one exception, the northern area, the darker the green, the more people. The northern area looks like it grew quite a bit, but that's largely reflecting growth that happened in the Clear Lake area because it's a very large polygon from the census, so a few houses can make a big difference. But you can see that there has been this organic, what we call infill, development happening on these parcels here, parcels there, backyards getting converted, lots getting split. So you can see that especially closer into the near River Road, you can see the area is becoming more green. Looking at this growth, looking at the land supply changing, Nate's crew in 2013 performed some wonky stuff in Oregon. It's called a housing needs analysis and a buildable lands inventory. In Oregon, part of our planning law and legacy is that we measure, we calculate, we plan. We don't let things get out of control or get ahead of us. So before we have a problem, we do research. That research showed that in the next 30 years, based on growth rates, births, jobs, all that good stuff, about 4,500 housing units were likely to be needed within Keizer proper. Looking then at the vacant land that was available and the rates of infill, there's a deficit of about 1,600 different homes, and they're broken down by type: single family, attached, detached, multifamily, mixed use. There's also some need for job lands to go along with that. As we build housing, we build jobs. And that was tallied as well. Overall, there was about 200 acres that they identified then as land that wasn't in the city as vacant, that would be needed if we were to accommodate that growth in the normal fashion, with another 40 or so for parks, and then another 60 or 70 for jobs. So you have, as cities grow, they grow in different types. So I mentioned the jobs here. We're doing plenty of room for industrial jobs. Most cities try to preserve that supply and not shrink it because it's hard to get it back, but there was a need identified for some commercial and some more institutional hospitals, schools, those kinds of jobs. And that together, again, is about 62, 63 acres as part of that 313-acre land need. So it's kind of a magic math here. We convert people, we convert housing into land need, and that's what they did at that step. So this kind of leads to that question is, all right, if our ability to grow in the fashion of building on those single-family lots, those remaining vacant pieces, is difficult, what are our options? And there are many, and we'll talk about that as we go along here. But one of the things I just kind of wanted to highlight, as these lots get smaller and fewer, there's a product type that we planners call the missing middle. It's these duplexes, garden apartments, things that are of a more neighborhood scale, but provide ability to get more units in a smaller space. And a couple examples, Salem has several of these. There's also one on the bottom of that slide, kind of an angular building that a friend of ours did, where she took a single lot in East Portland, in Woodstock neighborhood, and made 3 homes with 3 ADUs, accessory units, behind them, with a shared yard, preserving the trees. So it really fits into the neighborhood nicely, and so what would have been 1 home became basically 6. We'll go ahead, we'll try a couple questions, see if it hurts our time frame. Yep. Yep. Small home, accessory dwelling unit, like granny flat. Yep. Gotcha. So the request there was to minimize the use of acronyms. So we'll do that, or what we call planner ease. So the city's zoning is mostly single family. This is a kind of simplified map. In planning maps, we use yellow to show lower densities, single-family uses. We warm up through the oranges as we get into multifamily, and then typically mixed use and commercial are pinks, purples, and reds. So that's kind of what you're seeing in this map here, with the exception of the greens and blues for jobs and parks. Those kind of uses, those infill, smaller, middle density kind of properties are probably ripe through a lot of these yellow areas, where you think about that place where someone has a double-sized lot, things like that can fit in, but they don't show up as vacant land on any map, so there's opportunities there that might exist. The higher density housing, the apartments, condos, maybe townhouses too, is more likely to be in the areas where you see oranges or pinks, the mixed use on this map. So there are places then where it's developed. It might be a commercial operation now, it might be an apartment building. Is there more room? Is it aging? Is there a parking lot that could be converted? Different things the developers will look for as they're trying to bring housing to market. So there's a couple transitions here. Nate talked about the purpose of this is really looking at how does this affect our thinking in regards to the urban growth boundary. So before to get to that, I wanted to explain a little bit of the process. We've made a fairly linear kind of diagram here. The city has already gotten to step 3. So that was, they looked at what's our land need, compare that to our supply, and we've got the housing needs analysis report. This next step is where the city needs to go next, and this is helping us with kind of helping you inform the city staff and decision makers yourselves on what are the things you want to research further. So this is, we say, analyze and revise capacity within the UGB. What does that mean, revise? That is looking at policy changes that either make multifamily lands into mixed use or make some large single-family parcels into a more dense zone. That missing middle could be an example. It also means where cities invest in public-private partnerships to create new housing opportunities, working with developers. The planners, we sometimes call these efficiency measures because it allows us to use our land more efficiently within a boundary. So once we've looked at what those opportunities are, because they're not endless, so we look at what those opportunities might be, then we might revise how much our expansion need might be. Sometimes cities have found they can take it all internally by looking at that. Other times cities have said, okay, we got about a third of it by doing a little bit of turns, a little bit here and there. This is something Portland's doing right now, for example, is they're saying, corner lots should be able to have duplexes and triplexes in single-family zones. So pretty easy, just change on the letters, but the numbers add up over time. So so after you've done that, then that fifth bullet then is determine how much land is next. Then, when you go to this point and you've decided that you have to go beyond your urban growth boundary, then there's a very specific and structured process in law that we follow to look at where we can expand. And this is, Oregon state law has done an amazing job of preserving our farm economy, partly by having these very specific rules in law, actually. So what we have to do is we have to first look at lands that are not zoned for farm or forest use. And in this region, that's you can see in this map right here, near Keizer, the only lands that aren't zoned for farm or forest use are the Clear Lake area. We also have to look at the entire UGB, not just Keizer city limits. And this is why Nate mentioned this notion of the divorce. So for those not familiar with that term, it's a shared UGB. There's capacity within Salem's UGB and beyond Salem. Think about heading over toward, on the way to Detroit, there's even more lands that are non-farm and forest zoned. That if the joint UGB had to move, there's a lot of places it can move to take in non-farm and forest zone lands. So that's a mouthful. I'll try to say it slower next time. It also, there's the political process here, and we have two cities sharing a boundary, and we have the county who shares the overall growth forecasts and management of the rural lands. So all the governments need to be on the same page. So our system is set up to force cooperation. Can't be rogue very easily in Oregon. So there's a little background on how we move. So now we're going to go back to some of the cost information. Is there any questions on the urban growth boundary itself before I go and talk about this? Yes. Yes, so it's very small print, but you're right. And it's not single-family homes, it's housing units. So in Oregon, we call a housing unit, it can be a condo, an apartment, a single family home, any one of those. So it doesn't matter how many bedrooms are in it, doesn't matter if it has a driveway, just if it can house a family. So I forgot to put that on the record. The question was, could I verify that the housing need for 30 years was 4,500 single family homes, and I corrected it's all that dwelling units. Is there a question at the back? So the question is, this report was done in 13. Housing that's being done now, is that part of this number? Yes, it is. So if a house is built today, it's one of those 4,500. So the line started in 2013 when they did the analysis. Okay. Okay. All right. So let me get myself back to where I was. So we have the term costs of growth. There are costs, there are benefits, there are impacts, there are pluses, minuses to everything. And we have a lot of things to cover, so we're kind of going to hit some of the highlights here. But in general, there are some things that are very easy to put numbers to. You're going to build a treatment plant, you're going to build a highway, I can tell you how much it's going to cost, or I can find someone that can. There are other things that are harder to put numbers to. What's the neighborhood feels like. It's how willing are people to see their neighborhood develop in a different manner. Car accidents. Sure, you could monetize them, but it's pretty hard to do. It's easier to say how much a road costs than to say, well, every so many miles traveled, this many accidents occur, and therefore it's a little bit more difficult. So we're going to talk through both of these in these different categories. So I'm going to start with looking at infrastructure. All the studies out there, no surprise here. If you're going to be building outward, meaning onto greenfield land, expanding areas, and this applies to cities and states without any urban growth boundaries, greenfield, as we call it, vacant land development, requires more services. You have to put in new roads, you have to put in new pipes, new poles, all that stuff. So there's about a 30% higher cost than using something that's existing, which is not a huge surprise. There's also a long-term savings because of the operations and maintenance. You have to repave roads. If you build them today, in 20 years you have to put another coat on top of the asphalt. So that's not a huge surprise, but this is come from other research. There are also a number of factors that all work together to change the way, or to enable people to behave in different ways. So the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has spent a lot of time and money researching this because it has to do with clean air, water, which leads to human health and all this. When they have shown that areas that have a finer grid, a finer mesh road network, so think multiple routes, that have more transit is facilitated by that, have more people in smaller places, and most importantly sometimes is a greater mix of use types. When those things come together, people make shorter trips. They're often able to park once and do multiple errands, so they've made shorter trips on fewer trips. There's more walking that occurs, more transit. So there are health benefits that the feds have been documenting from that as well. And obviously, if you were to think about cars and global warming, anything that we do a little bit less of is a contribution there. So these are some of the things that have been published from the federal government. Let's talk about more specifically the things that go in the ground and who pays for them. So a lot of what happens during development is paid for by the developers, or they build it themselves. We've been pretty strong in this state and others in recent years, some would say too severe, in putting the cost on the newcomer to keep ourselves from having to take care of that burden. And it's a way of protecting our community budgets and everything. So what you have then is water pipes, all of that are owned by the city, but they're first put in the ground by the developer. So if you do a subdivision, all of that water and sewer you put into your spot, any pumps that are needed, you then give it to the city. You might be required, developers might be required to pitch in if there's a larger upgrade needed. Let's say the sewer line down the highway is at maximum capacity that you're going to hook into. They would pay their share into that. Or there's also what we call system development charges, and these are fees when you pay, I'm going to say SDC later so you know what I'm talking about. When you pull a building permit, when you build a house, you get levied a fee called an SDC that covers things like parks, streets, schools. So that's another way, and that is used for the city to save and purchase pipes and build pipes, and also for long-term operations and maintenance, because things are going to fail over time. Stormwater lately, Used to be a real big civic kind of expense, but nowadays almost all development treats their stormwater on site. It's part of our salmon safe development practices that we're trying to keep. Whatever rain hits our property, it leaves our property through the streams at the same rate it came on, so there's no gush of water anymore like we used to develop. Roads are a similar story, but get a lot more expensive. There's a couple classes of roads. I'm just going to simplify kind of big and little. The small roads in a subdivision, in a neighborhood, absolutely built by the developer, and in most every case, then dedicated to the city when they're done. Larger roads, or more specific, in Keizer, that really means expansions of larger roads. So say a river road, whether it's a signal or it's a lane, a turn lane, or an extending a road. Those are often built as government projects. Developers may be charged for them, but the important thing is here, developers can only be charged the proportion of their impact. So if I'm going to put, I can't even make up numbers. If my development is going to break a signal, meaning when I say break, meaning all of a sudden you're stuck through 3 light cycles, you can't get through. It's because I just put 1,000 more cars on the road with my development. I'm going to have to pay and help with that. But if that signal is already serving 30,000 people, well, my share is only 1,000. So as a developer, you can't make the developer pay for the whole thing. Now, sometimes they can make contributions and it's to their advantage to build that signal or things, but that's not always the case. Is that a wave or a question? Okay, all right. So, that's important to know. We have to provide these services, water, sewer, transportation. We have to provide them. It's very difficult in the state to have what we call a moratorium, where you shut something down because you're out of capacity. So cities have to be saving money to make those upgrades they know they're going to have in the future. So right now the city has water master plan, transportation master plan, sewer master plan, and those things are based on the existing growth rate and what's in the city's limits right now. Changes to that will necessitate some improvements coming online sooner, which means budgeting has to occur to make sure that can be covered. And part of that is through those system charges I talked about. Other things that are worth noting: parks, public safety, schools, libraries. Now, I don't know if the library would stay volunteer if you grew substantially or not, but you've seen from, whenever we grow, no matter which, style it is, more people just mean more use of things. I mentioned more people closer together. It might be shorter trips, but we still make trips. We all make about 10 trips a day, they say, no matter how we do them. We might walk them all, we might drive them all. But you saw in the recent park and police fee that things do get more expensive, and people's needs for services continue to go up. And so as we grow, we have to cover more of those. Talk about some of the less easy to monetize ones. I think this is a tough one. If you live outside of an urban growth boundary, you're operating an agricultural operation, you're going to be worried about any expansion because you make noise at night, you spray, whatever it's going to be, especially if, harvest times. So you can imagine that kind of person is going to be concerned about the change. You also have folks that are really happy living in a rural home site location. They moved there for a reason. They didn't want to be in a city. So there's a fear of change to that. And it's a real fear. And sometimes, and this picture on the bottom taken just off of Clear Lake is an example of some of those properties have really good investments on them. And even if we expand onto those areas, the value is too high for those to be taken out and a subdivision put in. So there's things outside of our control that also really affect people. And as planners, and elected officials and appointed officials, we are serving this public, and so it's on all sides. It's both the person looking for a new house and the person who's living in a neighborhood. We have to be thinking of all of them. Another one, and this is really unique to Keizer, but when we had some meetings with several of you and kind of talked about what's important, one of the things of note was that the kids in Keizer all go to one high school. And so something to consider, depending on if and how much the city were to expand to the north, which is the most likely direction, the school district boundaries, one, you have to negotiate with Jervis, but it could end up with some of Keizer's kids would have to go to one of the Salem high schools, more likely kids from southern part of Keizer, obviously. And then there's just the standards, congestion and traffic can go up. I don't ever believe congestion goes down. It always goes up, but we can make it so it's efficient, predictable, those sorts of things, but it is something we have to spend money on and we have to be careful about. And then energy. There's also some differences, and I think this is kind of a weird question, but a little bit of if we're expanding in an area that's pretty developed and we're expanding our urban growth boundary, who are we expanding for? Are they the kids in Keizer? You know, I've got cousins here that one's in medical school, and if he comes back, is he going to want to live in Keizer, or is he going to stay where he is in Arizona, wherever studying? Or is it someone working in Tualatin or Wilsonville that's seeing a price advantage and a better commute from here to there than it was from, you know, say Gresham? And the reason I want to put that out there is there's a different expectation of what people's needs and service needs and demands might be. If you take a high budget city like Wilsonville, and you've been to some of their parks, they've got some amazing facilities. I mean, they've got a restored barn that costs, you know, more than some of these big houses. You might have people with a high expectation for services. Well, Wilsonville pays a lot more property taxes than Keizer does. So that could be something to consider, is what their expectations are going to be. Obviously, Nate already talked about the number of building permits. No matter which way you grow, government's going to increase a little bit with growth. So it's, you know, whether it's infill or whether it's UGB. I mentioned intergovernmental relations. Some work will have to go into that. It's harder to quantify that. The cost does get borne by you because a lot of folks having to work and spend time and take away from other things sometimes. And then I threw in this picture here because this is a new development in Tigard. So I think in some ways Tigard is similar in that the age of the housing in Tigard, nice community neighborhoods, and the brand new stuff right next door. A lot of people in Tigard look at it and say, God, those houses are so big and so close together. Now, it's a nice development. They've got a pool, they've got play structures and all that, but it is a very different character. So some love it, some go, wow, they're so big and close together. So I just wanted to kind of share, those are some of the non-monetary things. I'm about to get the yank. I'm almost there, aren't I? Okay, so I'm trying to keep on schedule. So another thing I wanted to introduce here is, because I did bring up that card about the budget there a second ago. You know, a lot of us, I look at that nice house I showed you, for example, and you say, wow, that's a lot of tax revenue for the city. The funny reality, it's not funny, but the interesting thing that surprised me when I was a young planner is that often it's actually small lot small lot neighborhoods on a per acre or per foot basis are a bigger contributor to the city's tax base than a lot of people would think. We've got a little circle here. This unit right here, you can see, if you can, there's little red dots. In this case, this is assessed value per acre. So this is how much money comes into the city in taxes, and green is the lowest, red and purple is the highest. And so there's a couple of examples here how, while these townhomes might be cheaper than the single-family home next door, the tax revenue on a per foot basis is higher. This might be a better example. Here you've got really nice townhomes, really nice single-family homes, and again, from a budget perspective, those townhomes actually bring in a little bit more money. And I don't think anyone would think there's no difference in terms of service needs from those populations. These are both great products, good families. So I'm going to turn this over to Kate Rogers. We have done some studies looking at several cities and places that have expanded their urban growth boundaries to see what we could glean from that. And then after that, we'll take a pause and have another little round of questions and answers.
Thanks, Glenn. So Glenn, this sort of first part of the presentation has really been just sort of a broad overview about the urban growth boundary and potential growth situation, and then what the sort of general costs are for new development, regardless of location. And then the second half is kind of trying to look at some examples of real cities and other jurisdictions in Oregon, and a couple outside of Oregon also, and trying to figure out what lessons we can learn from those experiences of those cities. And the first part is looking at some cities who have either amended their urban growth boundaries, or regions that have amended, in the case of the Portland region, or have attempted to do that and have not been successful, or have kind of decided to pause that discussion for a little bit. So Woodburn, McMinnville, North Bethany in the Portland region, and then taking a look at some other peer cities in Oregon, and looking at the various growth patterns there and see what Keizer can learn from various growth impacts, and then other expansion areas in the Portland region. So just to kind of establish some basis for comparison. So Keizer's current population is around 38,000 people. And so we tried to find a couple of cities that were roughly the same population as Keizer to compare to. And then of course Salem, quite a bit bigger population. But, so that's just showing that comparison. And then this chart is showing you the average annual growth rates. The black is 2000 to 2010, so that's in the past, and then looking out into the future, the projected growth rates from 2017 to 2035. So, and these are kind of ranked according to those projected growth rates. So as you can see, Keizer is actually among these comparison cities or areas. Keizer is number 2, so it has a projected annual growth rate of 1.6%, which doesn't really seem like that much, but it does show some population growth being anticipated. One thing that is important to kind of keep in mind is that the smaller the city is, the bigger the population growth, the bigger impact that has on the percentage. So if you think about Salem, which has a much larger population, if you add, 1,000 people to Salem's population, that's a smaller percentage of Salem than it would be to Keizer. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at these sort of percentage changes. So the first city that we took a look at, looking at the urban growth boundary expansion process, is Woodburn. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Woodburn. It's located on I-5, about 15 miles north of Keizer. It has a lot of similarities. It's a roughly similar size. I think it's about 26,000 people, a little bit smaller. It is surrounded by a lot of really nice farmland, similar to Keizer. So sort of a similar context within the Willamette Valley. And they recently went through the UGB expansion process, or completed it, in 2016. It was not a short or easy process or a cheap process. It took over 10 years. The figures we read said that the city expended over $1 million in public funds. So that's probably a combination of staff time, planning budget, hiring consultants like OTAC to help them out, all of that. Very expensive. There were 2 challenges in the Oregon Court of Appeals that resulted in the city having to take a look at how it was sort of justifying what it was asking for and having to make some changes. And then finally, in the end, the process was resolved through a mediation. So what Woodburn initially asked for, this is just showing, you can see the nice farmland surrounding the city. We don't have a city boundary, but the city boundary pretty closely follows where the developed areas are for the most part. So the initial ask was 546 acres for residential, 409 acres for industrial, and just 22 acres for commercial land to be added to the UGB. And the biggest objection from 1,000 Friends of Oregon, which is a farmland preservation advocacy group that is often challenging urban growth boundary movements, was one of the biggest was the amount of industrial land that Woodburn was asking for, and they're able to kind of pick on any weak points in an argument, and this was a weak point they saw in Woodburn's argument about how they were justifying the amount of industrial land that they were asking for. But another point is the inclusion of this high value, high quality farmland in the UGB. That is often, one of the biggest things that they are advocating for is preserving that farmland. So the result, after many years of back and forth and going back and forth with the state, was that the state asked Woodburn to go into a mediation process with Marion County and with 1,000 Friends of Oregon and with the Department of Land Conservation and Development at the state. And a mediation is kind of an intensive negotiation process. And it really, once they got started with that, it only took, I think, a couple of months before they came to a decision. But Woodburn did have to make a few concessions as a result of that. And one of those was that they established these 20-year expansion limitations, which you can kind of see on the west side and on the east side of the city. So within 20 years, they won't be able to ask for any expansion in those areas, no matter what they are showing that their needs are. They also ended up removing 230 acres of what they were initially proposing to include in their urban growth boundary as urban reserves, which is kind of a, we can maybe look at this a little bit later, so kind of set it aside, but we're not going to be adding it to our UGB now. And they also ended up excluding approximately 125 acres of residential land that they initially proposed. So again, it was a long process. It was very challenging for the city, very contentious, but eventually they were successful. Another city that was not so successful is McMinnville. Again, another city that is roughly around the size of Keizer. Let's see, I think it's about 35,000 people now. Also in the Willamette Valley, also surrounded by nice farmland, and they grew pretty rapidly in the late 20th century. I think I read a figure that they doubled their population between 1980 and 2002. And they started taking a look at their urban growth boundary in 1996, and they ended up adopting their amendments to their UGB in 2003, and they went back and forth with the state several times. And then the decision was, of course, petitioned to the Oregon Court of Appeals, as so often happens. So then in the end, they ended up abandoning their plans in 2012. I'll get a little more into the details here. So this is an aerial photo of McMinnville, again, showing the nice farmland surrounding the city. So that McMinnville proposed to expand by 1,200 acres. Approximately 2/3 of that, or 800 acres, was high-quality farmland. And one of the chief arguments for for advocates was this inclusion of exclusive farm use land, but excluding this exception land, which is kind of a jargony term, but it's basically land that's been already developed with sort of very low density rural residential development. So basically, the way the laws work is you have to, if you're going to expand your urban growth boundary, you have to go to those exception lands first before you can seek out any prime farmland. So anything else about that? So one of the things, well, I'll skip that. So, so McMinnville ended up deciding that the process was too challenging. They'd spent about 10 years kind of battling with the state and then battling with these advocates, and decided that they didn't have enough or sort of energy or funding left to pursue it any further. So in 2012, they decided to put a pin in the discussion. And since then, they have made a few tweaks to their zoning to try to accommodate more growth within the city. But the city is now actually revisiting the process and thinking about another potential attempt at a UGB expansion now. So they have received a grant to revisit their housing needs and buildable lands. So they're kind of looking at the same questions that Keizer is looking at right now. Another area that we took a look at is North Bethany, which it's a little bit different context than Woodburn and McMinnville. It's part of the Portland Metropolitan Urban Growth Boundary Area. It's in Washington County. It's an unincorporated community in northeast Washington County. And this was part of a pretty large urban growth boundary expansion for the Portland metro area in 2002. And they were successful in expanding into this area, but it was held up in litigation for a few years, not quite the 10-year process that we saw in the other cities. But one of the big lessons that Keizer can take away from North Bethany is really what's happened after the urban growth boundary was expanded. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And North Bethany now is actually rapidly developing, but it really didn't see much development for quite some time after the UGB was expanded. So North Bethany is just north of the existing Bethany community. It's about 800 acres, and it included a sort of a balanced mix of farmland and exception lands. And they were able to justify the inclusion of the farmland because of its specific location in relation to the exception lands. So it's very much a case-by-case basis what you can justify, and you have to present very strong findings as to why you're including farmland if you are doing that for your UGB. As I noted, North Bethany is just one small area of a very large metropolitan area, so it's a very different context than Keizer is. And in 2002, when the UGB expanded there was also a number of expansions in other parts of the metro area, including a very large area in Damascus in the southwest metropolitan area, or southeast metro area. So it's important to think about that North Bethany was just kind of one small piece. It wasn't the whole deal. So that probably played some part in why maybe that it was approved, whereas other cities, have struggled a little bit more. So, and then, as I mentioned, the biggest story we think from North Bethany is that they faced a lot of challenges after they moved the UGB. So there was a 10-year lag between the expansion in 2002 and when the first houses were constructed. And during that time, there was a pretty long and contentious planning process. So when you bring all this land in, you have to do a lot of, visioning and sub-area planning. And the county, it actually originally started out as it was going to be part of Beaverton, and Beaverton was going to do the planning and was going to eventually annex the area. And Beaverton decided that it was too costly and too far away for them to extend any services to North Bethany. So then it went up to Washington County. There are also some pretty big challenges with funding the infrastructure that would be needed to serve all of these new housing units, particularly the transportation system, the road system. So there was a study that was done in 2008 which found that the existing funding sources that were in place at the time the UGB expanded, so that would include the county's funds and the systems development charges, or SDCs, charged to developers, would leave the county approximately $100,000 short on funding per house. So that adds up to quite a bit. So the county had to adopt this really large funding package for infrastructure funding, which included raising the SDCs pretty significantly, tapping into the Transportation Development Tax Funds, which is a countywide fund, up to $10 million from another countywide fund that came from property taxes, and adding additional property taxes to lots in North Bethany at a rate of $1.25 per $1,000 of assessed value. So it's very expensive. They had to find the money somewhere. They eventually did, but it was not an easy process. So some things for Keizer to think about should it consider how it might pay for any new development that could happen. Got a question back there?
So Matt Moyer, the Planning Commission. So this seems like it's predicated on Keizer being divorced from Salem's UGB. Was there not an opportunity to look at UGB expansions within a 20 or 30-year time frame with like Springfield, Eugene, or maybe Salem and Keizer previously to look at what that looked like? Because I feel like this is really great information if we're divorced from Salem's UGB.
That's a good question. So the question is, Glenn, yeah, you should come up here. Or you can, yeah. You can.
So to restate the question is, the analysis that we've shown is it predicated on a separated UGB from Salem? And I'd say pretty much the answer is yes. Those first slides we showed, there's enough capacity in the Salem UGB, either through annexation or through extension onto, like the whole UGB could grow, but it's as they're joined together in one, it'd be very difficult. I can't say impossible, very difficult to expand onto farmlands around Keizer if there are still exception lands. Exception lands are those rural residential lands that Kate mentioned. It's a legal term. So I think it would be difficult. And Eugene, Springfield did separate. For those who don't know, Eugene, Springfield had a shared UGB. Springfield was looking to grow. They did some of these same they were growing anyway, but they got transit and the BRT and all that, but they were looking at some of the same kind of combination of efficiency measures and expansion. And I think when it's all said and done, they did some policy changes and some efficiency measures. They did not expand their urban growth boundary. They've got maps of where they would, and they might have made urban reserves, but at the time, I think once they were all done with their analysis, they ended up not expanding, and I don't know enough about why.
So to clarify, this information is if a divorce happens, it has nothing to do with our current status quo, is that correct?
Question is, this information is based on if a divorce happened, not the status quo. I'm going to have to caveat the answer and say I have a hard time imagining that an expansion of the UGB could be made around Keizer without being separated. But the legislature is the planning commission for the state, so I don't have that kind of authority.
So I think that we're going to actually break for discussion right now. We've had a lot to chew on so far. So I think, Glenn, you're going to introduce these discussion topics.
Okay, so just through a couple tops, some of the things we've talked about up here, but I thought this would be a great time. You've been sitting and watching us for 35 to 40 minutes. It's a great time to get a cookie, get a glass of water. If there's questions, if there's, this is a great kind of foray into this. If you want to take this a little farther, we're here. If you want to go to the next slides, we can do that as well. So any thoughts? Yes.
Follow up on Matt's question, and has it
So let me, before we go much farther, see if I can restate for the group, in case you could not all hear or it's not recorded. Um, the question or topic discussion is, have we looked at, or what would it take for the city, what kind of effort would be expended to go after an agreement to split the urban growth boundary? And the rationale stated behind that is you end up then just having a county, the Marion County and the city as parties to an agreement related to an urban growth boundary expansion, and not also Salem. I think I would add some commentary to that in that, in the past, I'm not sure currently, I think Salem is redoing their Salem Futures project, but in the past, Salem has been pretty aggressive about wanting to grow and keep things tight. So I think that if that politics stays true in Salem, it does make it harder for Keizer to consider an expansion without separating the UGBs. The other then an answer is we didn't look at trying to develop a scope or cost or what that kind of negotiation might be. So we haven't looked into that yet. We know it's not just filling out some forms. It's so unprecedented. It's just only happened once. The other thing I would say is we also have some tough luck stories here with some of the cities that have tried this. But we also have learned a lot, and so things are other places, that are in the process now. South Hillsborough took a little while to come in, but they'll be sooner to build than, say, Bethany was. Beaverton, South Cooper Mountain, probably putting houses in within, well, they haven't done them yet, but they will within about 5 years of their expansion. So, there are reasons and needs. Sometimes we have learned we're doing things better. A law is an evolving body in general, but I don't know if I can give you a super succinct answer more than that.
Well, I think it should be part of when we're really evaluating, so we can make, or the elected officials can make an informed decision.
Yep.
Sure.
Which is going to serve the needs of our citizens best.
Well, I'm sorry to jump in here,
Absolutely.
Glenn. And I did want to point out before we were done tonight, we have a commitment from the staff at DLCD, Department of Land Conservation and Development, that this question is a lot more complex than should we get a divorce or should we not get a divorce? Is a divorce even possible without doing what Springfield and Eugene did? Or if it is possible, what does that mean for Keizer? Does Keizer then share the immediate burden to provide all of its land supply with all of the costs and all of the impacts and all of those kinds of things? So DLCD has committed to us that they are studying that and will give us information about that in the near future. So we have asked the question and they are working on it. I don't have any better answers than that right now, but it is obviously central to part of what we're doing here.
Yes, question in the front.
The option of not doing anything, what happens if we just don't do anything at all? Is that even an option?
So the question is doing nothing an option? It's always an option until someone complains, right? It really depends. I would have to have a crystal ball. If you were the Portland metropolitan area with the growth pressure they have and the powerful home building lobby, you'd likely get a challenge in court to not have your 20-year supply met. I don't know if that would be the case here. And again, with the land available in Salem, you're not likely to run into a hardship situation like they might be in a constrained, really fast-growing spot. But that's a hard answer to question. A hard question to answer. Easy for me to say. You're technically, if you're not supplying, our UGBs are supposed to have a 20-year supply of land, and technically, not growing in Keizer would still be legal because the urban growth boundary that is shared has a 20-year land supply that covers both. So I think doing nothing is an option. I think the more important question in all these planning things is not, do we comply with the law? Are we complying with the law? It's, are we providing for our community what our community wants? And so I think that's the bigger question. Do we have the housing choices we want? Do we have the transportation choices we want? Are we making the investments we want to be making? Those sorts of things. And so if, to the extent that growth enters into that picture, that's the better answer.
So my next question is that I know that the northern area and also the eastern area of our county and the boundaries of Keizer proper are farmland. And I could see in
Okay. The question, first a note that lands north and east of Keizer in Marion County are productive farmlands. What research or discussions have been having, or are people concerned in those areas related to growth? There have not been any conversations I know of with the folks there. I talked a little bit about the state law, and when we expand a UGB, we have to first look at, those non-farmlands, call them exception lands because they've had a formal exception to the farming goals and laws. And then if we're out of that, we can look at farmland that is surrounded by development, which you might have seen in Hillsborough because there's development on 3 sides. We can then start looking at land from the worst soil class up, starting up to toward the top. So class 6 or 7 soils, the stuff that you can grow grapes on, would be a more likely candidate than the class 2 and 3 loams that are, grass seed farmers are using. So legally, it's, when I say legally, I mean, if I follow the rules that are out in front of me, it's pretty darn difficult to make a UGB expansion on a farmland. It is protecting those folks' livelihoods. There are, as you saw, examples, though, like there was some prime farmland up in the Bethany area. And the combination of proximity to jobs, existing traffic in the area already, viability of that farming economy because of where they were next to Hillsborough and Beaverton made it a little bit more attractive. And like Kate said, it is a case-by-case basis. So we know overreaching doesn't work. Asking for too much, like we saw in the McMinnville and the Woodburn example, the first try. Taking too much of the wrong land doesn't work. What we don't know is what's the right amount. Is there a right amount? If a smaller strategic, kind of request is easier to make findings for and get approval. I would say, on a legal stuff aside, if the counties, the cities, and the state, and the advocates, the Farm Bureau, others, work together to come up with an agreement that everyone liked, then something could probably happen. If a city just tried to put together a proposal and expand, they would likely get shut down.
So I feel like we have 2 pieces of, or maybe 4 pieces of information.
Okay.
This is the divorce, this information, and what could happen if Keizer were divorced from Salem. I think what's important for people in Keizer to be informed is going to be what it's going to look like with a shared UGB expansion, how all of this kind of plays in, and or what the process with Gary brought up is going to be and what the process is going to look like, and really kind of draw that out and explain it, because I think that those are 2 really key pieces of information right now that are not before us, and we're kind of just moving forward as if this has already kind of happened, right? So it feels a little bit like the cart before the horse.
Trying to figure out how to restate this one. So for the microphone, maybe I should have brought it over. Okay, so the notion is there's kind of four things to touch on. We've touched on 2 of those, which is the growth related to the overall UGB and what it would take to have a separation or divorce. And the parts that we're not looking, I haven't talked about yet are, what's the,
How the divorce happens, right? So
how that takes place. Okay, how the divorce takes place.
this information is presented as if the divorce has happened, right? What we're not talking about is how the divorce would have to happen.
Right.
And or if the divorce doesn't happen, how we progress the UGB with a shared UGB.
Okay. So the 2 points then is what would it take to make the formal separation so the UGB is 2 instead of 1, and if it doesn't separate, how does growth accommodation work? So Nate mentioned that the state is working on putting together a white paper for the city that helps answer the questions of what does it take. Because as he mentioned, the one that's happened was done by the legislature. So maybe that's what it takes. It's hard to say. I also want to predicate that the examples that we've shown and my statement about the ability to expand a UGB is definitely a lot more doable if you're your own UGB. It doesn't mean agreements couldn't be reached. I just haven't. There's no path in the statute that shows how that happens automatically. So the last part of the question then is how does growth occur if the UGB stays as 1? Right, and so one component of that would be, okay, no split UGB. The most likely, I mean, I I can't crystal ball this too well, but the most likely is you continue to use the infill lands, the vacant lands that have been being used in the city. There's likely, and already seeing some redevelopment happen in River and Cherry and places where there's higher densities and more access, whatnot, and transit. Salem would probably continue to do similar, and they would probably use more of their annex out toward the edge of their UGB. I don't know at what time there would be a need for movement. I haven't looked at their numbers. I do remember from, was it 15 years ago they did the first Salem Futures. I think they declared no need, but that was quite a long time ago. So I'm not quite sure on that. The last part, though, that we just did mention is, it's not impossible that there's an agreement to say, all right, let's do some kind of regional sharing, and you do this, we do that. I just don't have a precedent for it from which I can draw. Okay.
I'll just say, we could ask the Salem planners that are here.
Yes.
If I remember right, the Springfield split was legislated because that was formed while they were both cities, where Keizer Salem is different and it's not a legislative issue. I may be incorrect, but
The question, discussion here is, are the cases the same between Keizer, Salem, and Eugene Springfield in terms of how the UGB applies to the city limits, whether they're joint or separate? And my recollection was pretty much most of the UGBs came in around the same time.
Well, so the comprehensive plan was developed when we were not a city. And so all of that happened before we were separate, as a separate jurisdiction. So we shared that, and we shared that UGB. That was all created at that time. Then we came about, and we basically just said, okay, we're going to take that comp plan, and we're going to use that, and this is going to be us. Matt, the reason I jumped up here is because a lot of this is catch-22 stuff. How are you going to know if you want to get a divorce unless you decide what are the outcomes you are seeking? And until you decide, is that the direction we really want to go? Do we really want to have that happen in our city? And again, I was going to save this for the last, but might as well share it now. This is only one small piece of the work that we are doing. We are, as the same group, and the reason it's so confusing, many of you are part of the stakeholders committee. We've been doing these interviews. Well, there's these two processes. There's this education outreach process, and then there's the Keizer revitalization. The bottom line is that revitalization is looking for those efficiency measures that Glenn talked about. We're going through that whole process, and we want to make this as efficient as we possibly can, so that we can then create those growth rates, depending on what the outcomes of all of this work is. After that project is done, we have the Metropolitan Planning Organization has funded a cost of growth to the transportation system study that we will then jump into with a lot of vigor, because, okay, let's say we decide we want to grow. Let's say that it is efficient and we can pay for the cost of growth. Then at that point, we also need to decide, what is that going to do to our system? Are we going to have to rebuild all of our roads? Then the kinds of things that Glenn is talking about here all of a sudden just doubled. And those costs then go from really amazing to what has just happened. So your questions are great. These things have to be answered. We are working on them, and we're working on them a step at a time. A little cart before the horse, you asked. Well, the reality is everything is I'm not sure where the cart is, and nobody is. That's the issue. So we're trying to put all these pieces together, and then we will then approach the council and say, here's the information you got. Here's the expectation of what the cost of growth is. Here is what the efficiency measures that we can create are, which will give us X number of growth potential. And then, by the way, this growth is going to have this impact on your transportation system. Are you prepared for all of that? And if so, then we will make decisions. So, sorry, Glenn. Wait. No, this is his show, not my show.
Can you answer my question though on the differences between Springfield, Eugene, Keizer, as far as the legislature being involved?
Well, I can't completely because I haven't studied the Springfield Eugene, but my understanding was it was statutorily required. Somehow it was written into state law that they had to be married, and they had to go back to the legislature before they could go anything. Ours is not the same. Ours is different. It falls under different law, under land use law. We share a UGB. We have an agreement. It's called a SCAPAC agreement, Salem Keizer Area Planning. Julie, what's the last? Anyway.
It doesn't matter.
Committee. Yeah, it's a committee. Another one of these crazy names that doesn't make any sense. So there's a lot of stuff that is like this, and that's why I have asked the state, you gotta start unraveling this mess so that we can make some adequate decisions.
Thank you. At the Strategic Economic Development Corporation luncheon today, we got a report from developers in commercial, industrial, and residential real estate. And one of the keys is that the dearth of land for housing is creating increased costs for producing housing, and it is accelerating economic segregation, which is putting additional pressure on our transportation system, forcing people to live farther and farther away from their place of employment, because those urbanized areas or gentrified areas are beyond the reach of people who work in those areas. So part of what I'm looking for here is that where is this going to help relieve some of that pressure to allow people to have affordable housing that doesn't require them to live in cities outside of our area. Right now, our biggest growth in single-family residential is in Dallas, Almsville, Turner, Stayton, and forcing people to live farther away to drive in for jobs. Obviously not in Keizer because we're not exactly a industrial hub yet. So is there any room in these calculations talking about impact that the urban growth boundary collar has on the accessibility to housing and employment?
I'm going to try to paraphrase that with the last part of Stephen. The question is, what is the relationship between the urban growth boundary as a control device and the accessibility of housing, specifically as it pertains to commutes and living closer to places of work, and the notion of having to go farther for more affordability? There are many, many, many debates on those topics. I generally am an advocate for housing is almost always a positive because it takes pressure off of the housing, it takes pressure off to create availability at the different market sectors. The stuff I showed you in Tigard, that stuff is all north of, it's probably $500,000 to $600,000 a house. That's the brand new stuff on the small lots. That's just what it's costing up there. But that's still a good thing for Tigard because they need housing. And so that's probably intercepting someone living in Yamhill and driving into the Portland area because now they can come closer. Same kind of thing that you're hitting at with folks living up in the canyon cities to come down to Salem for work. And so when I talked a little bit earlier about there's those EPA factors on what lead to healthy communities and in many ways, the proximity of not just the place you work, but places where you shop, go to your haircut, and all those things, they all have a ripple benefit effect in shorter trips. So from the transportation side, those are all beneficial. The economic side, there is study on, the housing burden, the cost burden, we call it. I actually have a little bit of that coming up. It just a little bit, just touched on. We didn't really, that could be its own research paper, and there's a lot of people, weighing in on that. So we'll go a little bit. I do want to make sure, I want to stop presenting in about 12 minutes so we can then have the last 15 minutes to talk. So there's one in the back, and then I'm going to jump back onto the microphone, and then we'll wrap up in 12, 15 minutes.
I'm going to say yes and I'm not going to
Yes.
I just wanted to answer that question. We did our own study of our housing needs, our economic opportunities in 2015, I think, and we have enough land for the next.
Okay, the answer for those who couldn't hear was Salem has done their housing needs assessment analysis and has determined that they have enough room in their UGB for 20 years of growth. Okay, I'm going to jump back on the microphone, go through some slides, and I won't labor them too long because they can get kind of nerdy. This one's going to be super fast. I dug through details and details in city budgets trying to find direct linkages to how the growth was affecting them after the fact. Didn't find a whole lot. What you find are these anomalies things. 1 year you do a treatment plant, but then you don't, and you're recovering it for the next 10 on ratepayers. But what I did start looking at then was the system development charges that we talked about. And so I'm gonna, because that ended up being where the big budgetary change, when you looked at the income, where the incoming cash versus outgoing cash occurred. So I'm going to talk about these a little bit in general. I mentioned them before. I remember these are SDCs, system development charges, and also fees. You can call them what they are. So we're comparing, this is, I'm going to do both metro area, Portland metro area, and then some Keizer peer cities for context, okay? The first thing is we saw in places that expanded and have new development, there's about a 25% jump in their SDCs. So these are actual numbers here. The average in the Portland metropolitan area is about $36,000 a house. And in the expansion areas, the 4 that we looked at, the average is about $44,000, $45,000. So it's a little bit of a jump. Those numbers might seem crazy. They are way different than what we're getting in the Mid-Valley, but it's expensive infrastructure, and they have to build bigger roads too because they have a lot more people. And we've broken it down. You can see the bar on the left shows that transportation was the biggest one that went up. So the conveyance of people was the absolute biggest. If we look at some peer cities here, some of these have done urban growth, like Redmond has moved its urban growth boundary and successfully developing in it. Redmond is actually a great city to learn from. They've done an amazing job. They even bought industrial land and leased it out at below market rate based on the number of family wage jobs the employer will provide. I was really just amazed by the altitude of that city. Anyway, so so you got your comparison here. You can see, Woodburn, now that they've had to calculate their SDCs to make sure they're working nowhere near what you're seeing in the Portland metropolitan area. Probably a better bellwether for what you'd be looking at. Keizer is really on the bottom end of the SDCs, although there are some cities that don't charge them. But at $4,400 per, these are single-family house numbers. So that's just something to think about. What this means, this goes into the price of the house. So it does affect who's buying the house. This isn't money that you spend, it's what goes in the house. It's not as big. I mean, when I saw the 50,000 numbers a couple of years ago up in Hillsborough, I can see why the housing isn't affordable. And so I think this does go a little bit to that notion of, is it the land price or is it the price of infrastructure? I have felt for a number of years while things were in limbo in Portland that the UGB wasn't even there, that it was infrastructure keeping things from developing. And I think we're finally breaking that knot and they're getting to develop. Another part you talked about this, the kind of the cost burden of transportation, and this goes exactly what you're saying, Mayor. If an average family spends $10,000 a year on their car, that's gas, insurance, payments. The longer you drive, that goes way up. And as you said, if you're working a $15 an hour job, that gets hit into your budget really fast. So those enabling people to have shorter commutes and shorter trips to errands is a very tangible way to improve quality of life, money into groceries instead of gas. So there's a correlation between one of the big correlations between land use and that kind of driving. It's not just supply, but it's mix. It's what we call a diversity. So having, one of the things that, and you mentioned this, that Keizer has less than 1 job per household. It's like about 0.4, 0.5. The growth forecast is for still just under 1. Those numbers don't portend well to trying to shrink that $10,000 number on cars, because as you grow, you're continually looking at people having to drive farther out. And that's one of the things that most kind of bedroom cities have to deal with that, but it's worth thinking about. And that's one of the ways that you saw in the Woodburn example. They were looking, can we expand for jobs to try to fix some of our balance? And Wilsonville has been very effective at zoning for jobs to get themselves in a really healthy balance, so their trip capture is high and their tax base is high. It's also worth mentioning, and there are people that can't drive to where they can afford because they can't drive. whether they're kids, young people with jobs, people who are disabled, people who can't afford it, or the elderly. So there's a social benefit, there's a benefit to them by having places that people can use transit, can walk and bike, which are other considerations. So this is, if you looked at the website walk score, a lot of people do this when they look to buy a house, and it kind of tells what the neighborhood's like. There's a couple of things I want to pull from this. Keizer's pretty average here on what we call the walk score. This is that mix of destinations, number of intersections, sidewalks, mix of people. What's interesting is if you compare, so if Keizer's 35 overall out of 100, Chemawa state node here is like 83. It's really pretty high. You've got transit, you've got short blocks, you got walking is easy, you got things to go to, you got restaurants. I just took a quick snapshot up at Clear Lake area to see what the difference was, and obviously with nothing there, it'd be very low. So growing, comparatively, growing where there's no much services, you want to be extra careful to bring in more of a mix. If you're going to be growing in a place that's, a two-legged stool, add the third leg so you can get the jobs, the street connectivity, and the housing so that you can build that walk score in with it rather than thinking about kind of a more of a homogeneous type of growth pattern. Just a couple other examples to show the same point. Woodburn and McMinnville, a little bit better. One of the main reasons, and you'll know this if you get stuck in traffic on rivers, they have more than one route, north and south, east and west. That's one of the big things. They've got multiple options. The Bethany area that Kate talked about right now is a really bad walk score. And these are short blocks, but right now it's only housing. And not all of it's built yet either. Just to the south where there's a commercial center, it's higher. So those are like a great park once district, I like to call it. You go to shopping and dinner and something else all in the same trip. Another good example is because it's hard to find expansion or new growth that has been there long enough to make a difference. And this is a really nice neighborhood in Sherwood, if you know Sherwood. This is the Sunset Boulevard area. I think it was built in the mid-90s. Really attractive, nice sidewalks, YMCA, and it is, about a third less walk score than the city of Sherwood as a whole, even though it has a lot of those nice elements. It's a very quality neighborhood. So this does mean that those folks are going to have to drive a lot more often than someone living just a little bit different in Sherwood or someone living in Beaverton, just because of that. So let's see, there. All right, I know I'm going fast, but I want to give you 15 minutes for us to talk. So looking at the total miles traveled, we wanted to look at examples of places in Oregon that had sprawled and places that hadn't, and it's really hard to find because people in Oregon have pretty much done a pretty good job of not having a sprawl pattern. So we cast a little wider net, and so this is, VMT stands for vehicle miles traveled. So this is how much the average person in any one of these places drives on a given day, driving by themselves. So luckily, we are doing some positive affirmation here in that the Oregon cities we looked at, we're doing better. Lower VMT is better. It means you drove a shorter distance, you polluted less, you spent less money on fuel. A couple miles difference actually is quite a big deal. We know, so it may not look as huge as it does, but I think that's worth noting that places like Spokane that now has a UGB are playing catch up to us. And then places, like Stockton, my in-laws live there. That's a good, commuter suburb to Sacramento, another capital city, but it's farther away. And so that's probably what you're seeing if you're in Staten, something more like that. So I also wanted to hit on this, going back to those people who don't have ready access to a car, is that, how are these cities comparing in terms of the ability to use to transit? And so this is actual what people did in their patterns. The census asks people how they get around. These might be kind of hard to read. I've taken the bottom 50% off the graphs. Anything below the 50 line is a drive alone. So almost every place is a drive alone majority. Woodburn is actually the best at just 65% of the people driving alone for all their trips, so more carpooling and whatnot. And they don't have a big giant transit system, so they're doing a lot of carpools, their biggest one. I think what you're seeing in Keizer is that you're ahead of other more commuter cities, fast-growing Ridgefield, Washington, or Battleground, Washington. They're both really linked to the Vancouver Central Business District and economy. Have nowhere near as much walk-bike, so I think you have a much better network here. So that's something you'd want to continue as you look at growing, no matter where you're growing, whether it's it's retrofitting or it's growing out. And then the work at home is kind of a variable that is kind of hard to predict, but I think so it was kind of interesting to take a look at. So that is the end of the slides. So now we have a good 15 minutes or so to have a conversation. A few of the kind of high point takeaways just to help springboard this that I wanted to just throw up on the screen. There's impacts that have to be weighed. There's benefits and minuses to anything we do. We haven't planned for large-scale expansion yet. This is a conversation to say, hey, should we be? So a lot of things will have to be put in place and changed to make that work. We can assume that building an expansion area will be more expensive on a per house basis than building an existing town. However, at some point, as you mentioned, you may run out of room to build a single-family home in town. And what's left, if I were to look at what your capacity is now, probably a lot of it is in the multifamily category. Your system development charges will most likely have to go up, and that's documented by everyone who's been growing at all. The reason it's worth mentioning here is Keizer's a low-fee city, and I mentioned that earlier with the service demands folks might have. So it's just worth thinking about. Are you prepared to be refocusing and to be good with the public dollar? Means charging people for their impacts, and what does that do to the ability to develop? In some cases, we saw in the early days in North Bethany that the cost, and in South Hillsborough, the cost of the infrastructure put the brakes on development entirely. And they had to be really creative to get the funding open to get that development to happen. Now it's going like gangbusters. It's also a great economy, and that was 2008 when it was faltering, when no one had a job. So it was a different time, but it's worth knowing. So the question is the price point, though, for what it takes to build those homes, is it going to be still competitive with other mid-valley cities to where a builder can build them for a profit, or will they sit for a while until the supply gets less? So anyway, that's kind of a few things, but there's a whole lot of topics, so just open it up and we'll continue the conversation. Yes?
You mentioned in the introduction that there's a requirement or 500 homes next 30 years. That works out to be 150 a year, roughly. And it seems to me if suddenly the economy doesn't continue 2006 and 150 is enough for what you're talking about. One of the other things, I was involved up in Seattle many years ago, searching for infill sites for the Seattle Master Building. We found hundreds and hundreds of small area of South Seattle with sites that were large, that could hold more than one home. Small pieces of land that could be subdivided. I would concentrate very much on getting an inventory of existing. Certainly could run you for a year or two, maybe longer. If the economy doesn't continue to go up, it may be.
I'm going to make a short paraphrase of that, more a suggestion than a question, but acknowledging that the housing needs analysis showed there would be a need for about 4,500 homes. Annually, that comes down to around 150 or so. That's not a huge amount of homes. If the economy slows down, that might absorb some of that need. And also the notation that from past experience working in Seattle, and I've seen this in many cities, there's a lot of untapped potential in existing properties that, as you mentioned, could have one more house or could be redeveloped to be a small subdivision of 10 houses. Sometimes it's duplexes and triplexes. So there is a lot of that out there in a lot of places. We haven't looked at the single-family areas around Keizer to see what kind of underutilization there might be yet, where you have lots that are larger than allowed and they could double. We are looking with the city at the lands around River Road and Cherry, kind of a quarter-mile buffer on there to see where the mixed-use multifamily potential might be. That's a very good note. I've got there and then there. So you're second first. Yeah.
So have you looked at how a UGB expansion would affect the values of land currently developed, and how that might encourage the infill?
So the question is, have we looked at how a UGB expansion might affect the value of land within the city and the UGB, and if that would change the economic potential for infill and redevelopment? I haven't done any analysis specifically for that. I don't imagine there'd be a hit. I know that, some people say, well, why would I be for a UGB expansion? My taxes might have to cover more infrastructure, and my house value is just going to keep going up if we can't expand. I haven't heard it put the other way. I've never heard of someone being worried about their value going down with expansion. The only way I would imagine that would happen would be if a city got themselves into a bad debt situation, and they couldn't provide services to existing residents. But I haven't seen that. So.
I guess, second part of my question, meaning if you kind of take the pressure off existing developed land to intensify, would that
So would
necessitate a replan?
would removing would adding supply remove the pressure? It's really based on what'll pencil, and if it's penciling out in an expansion area, it's probably penciling on an infill lot as well. We're seeing in the Portland area they're both at the same time, and I think I have not seen a situation where an expansion is big and fast enough that it is really an escape valve or release the pressure. So yes.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to clarify, just at the beginning, you talked about the housing needs analysis. I know I went through that with everybody, and the 4,500 was what we needed for 30 years, but that took into account every single infill that we have, didn't it in Keizer? All of the empty land and everything that we have?
Yes. So the 4,500 is based on growth projection. The need for 1,600 after that means after you've taken out the available land that is zoned, and I'm not sure to what degree they went into redevelopment analysis in that, or if it was mostly vacant.
It was thorough.
It's thorough. Okay. So,
Yeah, there was.
Lot by lot.
so that includes some efficiencies then. Okay. So, do I need to paraphrase that question, or is it okay? All right. John.
There's so many elements to this.
There are.
Looking at the surrounding area, Kathy alluded to this, but the communities in the commute shed are just growing like crazy. Woodburn has 800 units in the pipeline right now. Millersburg has 500, and we're seeing massive expansions in Dallas and Sublimity with over 200 lots, and Turner with a combination of multi and single family with over 300. And so this commute pattern really makes a difference. And what
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about, and Keizer is ideally located to be part of that because of the freeway access, the proximity to the Portland area. This work that you've done is really focused on the cost of growth.
Correct.
There needs to be a look at the opposite side of that equation, is what is the cost of not growing? And I'm not advocating
Mm-hmm.
one way or the other, but I think we really need to understand both of that because stagnation of growth can have cost to it over time, impacting property tax values and a number of things. The loss of those 1,200 or 1,400 additional homes for which there isn't room now, what does that cost us? Part of what I'm wrestling with, looking 20 years down the road, what's the compelling arguments for what's in the best interest of this community, financially and in terms of livability? I've long known, as many of us, that Keizer could never justify an urban growth boundary expansion as long as it was part of the Salem-Keizer urban area. Logically, growth happens in South and West Salem because of the lack of farmland or less farmland. So I wrestle on why there is a compelling need to actually physically grow as opposed to infill and stop at that point. I think that's a conversation the community has to have.
Absolutely.
I'm asking you the
No,
question.
absolutely.
I'm making the statement that
Yep.
there's this vision thing
Mm-hmm.
of really understanding what the character is best for this community.
Right. Yeah, a visioning exercise. So the paraphrase was talking about how do we have a conversation about what the pros and cons are from a community character, long-term desire standpoint, and reference visioning. That is a logical next step, and what I would be looking at, what I would want to participate in would be future visioning and scenario planning, and you want to run traffic analysis models, to look at what the costs are. You want to examine your infrastructure capacities. And I think one of the other things that gets kind of left behind too is, this is nerdy stuff, we call preference surveys. What are people looking for? Matching incomes and other factors to what product type they're going to want. A lot of the planning we do at a statewide level is just a number or two. It's this many units, this many multifamily, this many single family. But we know there's a real difference between some single family homes are super affordable, some are super expensive. Same thing with apartments. It's not affordability has nothing to do with it. It's location, it's amenities, it's features. And so I think kind of where we're going here is, what do the people in Keizer want to have, now and in 50 years and their kids and long term? What's that ultimate community mix? And it's always growing, always changing, but what is that mix? And that's where the scenario planning can really come in. And you also need to look beyond the city, and you really need to be looking at, to really effectively do that, you have to look at a regional approach, because that's where your city to city, patterns are. I have seen, and it's anecdotal, and I think you probably agree with me, living in the Portland area, I've seen, and I've done some mapping, the growth in the smaller communities around the area has been a lot faster than they'd ever seen. And I think it's a quality difference. I think it's wanting to recognize people at the store. I think it's going to church with folks you know. I think we can't make, the Portland area, we can't make that product anymore of the smaller city, the smaller town. And so I think that there's that place for them. And the tough thing we have as a state is a lot of those smaller communities don't have the ability to create the economic power within them. So we are getting more of this cross commuting. And sometimes I would say that we should run a train to Yamhill, and expand Yamhill. So there you go.
And they would say no. But
Yeah, right.
Keizer's in this unique position in the state in that it's one of the few places that can say no.
True.
And hold its boundary simply by saying no, we're not going to split the urban road.
Mm-hmm.
Woodburn can't do that. Mount Angel can't do that. So I'm wondering, where's the compelling argument to grow? That's what I'm going to look for.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the compelling argument that says it's in the community's best interest to expand the boundary? And sure, it's expensive, but there's a flip side.
Right.
They know all of it.
Let's see if some of the other folks in the audience have the answers to that. You had a question, maybe you have the answer. John's question was, what is the compelling reason to grow, or is there one?
I actually, off of that, I do have a question, and I can't see the map.
Oh.
It's very detailed, so I'm assuming we're looking at I-5 into Brooks.
Oh yeah, this is just
But that's the general.
this is the city itself. There's the whole city as a zoning map.
So one of the things that talking to people in Keizer and really trying to listen to what people are talking about is our economic development and our jobs and keeping things local, making it more affordable, because the more pressure we're getting from Portland, the people that are commuting, that's who's taking up our houses. And we welcome them, we want them in our grocery stores, but at the same time, it's driving our cost of living high.
Right.
And that's really hard for our families that are struggling, or our big families, or have lots of kids, or our seniors who are on fixed incomes. That's part of the discussion, I think. So that being said, I think we really need to look at towards up I-5. We talked about the growth. We've talked about bringing in some some sort of industries to give us more jobs, to support and get our housing down. That being said, my question is I guess a little bit, and it is confusing, so I apologize if this is repetitive, but I know a lot of the conversation is, 20 years ago we had a plan and we talked about all of this. I'm not sure if we've met those needs now at 20 years from 20 years ago. I think we have more growth than we had planned, and we have more pressure on our roads, and I don't think I'm alone in that thought. So my question would be is, how do we relieve that pressure off of River Road and off of making Keizer Station? We want the businesses to be supportive, but how do we get some of the traffic off of that and move it around? And so to me, it's kind of a twofold of it's a safety issue for our kids. We can't cross River Road safely at times. There's let's get some of that. I don't think we saw 20 years ago the pressure that we have on River Road today, and that's what I hear the most.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the kind of question, comment on kind of a separate topic is, how did we grow compared to what we projected in terms of impacts, traffic, everything else. And then the second part of that question was, what are the techniques, the things that we can do to improve that quality of life within the city? The set,
It's more part of the conversation, maybe not even
Yeah.
an answer. I don't
Yeah.
expect you to have that answer, but you know, we've come a long way in 20 years. I don't think we exactly planned it perfectly, but let's look at that next 20 years to make sure that we have safe city streets for our families.
Right.
And people aren't running into each other on the river because it is scary. It's a very
Yeah.
fast one way, you know, one way kind of where all our traffic is.
And like a parallel route. Okay. You in the back and then to the side.
And to a certain degree, I agree with what Amy's saying. I think that if we have the opportunity to really have a specific focus on those industry jobs, family-based jobs that'll reduce the commute, then that walking score you talk about can also be increased as a result of that. But I think it has to be very targeted. I think we have to some degree, have to look at what we currently have. The struggle with that is you have one north and south route. So then what do you do with your main north and south route? Do we look and focus more towards Cherry? Is that something within the expansion? I don't know the answer, but I know that there is a heavy desire for people to live in Keizer to want to work here. The problem is those big family-based jobs are hard to find in Keizer right now. So whether it's specialty medical, whether it's IT, whatever that is, that's scalable, so it's not big, strong data centers or something like that. That's a conversation worth looking at.
And I think some of that was borne out by the economic opportunities analysis that showed those institutional jobs and the commercial needs. I had a.
I think this conversation could take a different turn if you considered Keizer to be landlocked. Lake Oswego cannot expand. It's surrounded, it can't be bigger. Keizer is surrounded by valuable farmland, so we just considered this is our boundary. And if we're going to grow, we have to grow smart within the boundary we have. It really can change the
Yeah.
conversation for some people.
Yeah, so the question there is, maybe the consideration is are we an island? Are we surrounded because of the farmland, similar to Hawaii?
So I might push back a little bit on that. While Lake Oswego is not able to expand, they also have multiple routes in, out, and through. And with farmland, that is more like having the river, which we all know we cannot cross. So the housing in West Salem really doesn't do us a whole lot of good in the housing needs analysis. And I think that's something else we need to take into consideration. I appreciate bringing up Seattle, and I think that's a great example of what we don't want to become.
And I'm going to just add real quick, Lake Oswego will expand a little bit to the south at the Stafford Triangle. Westland, Lake Oswego, and Tualatin are working on that right now. But it's not big. Not big, no.
But you can look to Milwaukee and Quad for that stuff.
But they have multiple routes.
Yeah. And you saw that, the multiple route thing, one of the reasons, McMinnville had a higher score for walk, and Woodburn too, was multiple routes. Not just north-south, but also east-west.
Yeah, one of the things that I think the biggest question here is we want to, as a community, grow. That's number one. Don't spend all the money, don't do all that if the vast majority of people don't see it. Like John's about what does that cost? I have a perspective maybe a little different than a lot of people here. I've lived here all my life. My family's been here since
situations, living situations are, we really have to pay attention to. I just don't think we can take the next 20 years to not hear what our families need, and that scares me.
I mean, it's a big citywide strategic plan issue because there's just so many moving pieces. Yeah.
So I get
One
that
minute.
you've got, I'm sorry.
No, yeah.
I got that you've got a citywide kind of evaluation here and a regional, but Portland's a huge hit.
Mm-hmm.
The commute, and I don't know if we know the numbers of how many people live in the Salem-Keizer area and commute down from Portland. It's kind of a successional process. They get pressure out of the Bay Area, goes to Seattle, gets pushed down to Portland, and Portland, then people buy homes in the Silverton, Woodburn, Jervis, out into the outlying areas. What are the jobs that are, what are people's, the commute patterns? Do we know that?
We do. The question is, what are the commute patterns within commuting, out commuting? I don't have the numbers in front of me. We brought that to the city from some federal sources that showed in versus out commuting. Do you remember the percentage, Kate? Okay, you have a very large share of people out commuting, as you suspect. Part of that also, you have a unique situation, and my anecdote is my wife's aunt and uncle. She was a teacher here, and he was a lawyer in Portland and took the van pool. So you're very uniquely situated to where they could have the neighborhood they wanted and have two separate jobs. So that's also kind of a thing. But yeah, and the out commuting, that is something that is an issue.
Give jobs to
Right.
current, the residents. In fact, what you may find is you've got a swapping out of populations that begin to happen, and Keizer really does look like more of a bedroom community. You've got the high tech or, your IT kind of people, that population that works in Portland that commutes down. So, we're just relieving the pressure for Portland at that point.
I would say there's a dynamic where you have some of the higher wage earners leaving for jobs elsewhere and more of the service workers coming in. So it's not necessarily the pattern that is ideal. And that's when we talked about the forecast. I think we're almost out of here, but you had your hand up.
Comment, all this growth is also seen in our special districts that we have that overlay our city government as well. Fire district is really falls and rest level because of our
Mm-hmm.
kind of is urban growth.
Mm-hmm. I think we're out of time.
We are.
Okay.
But I did want to stay here.
Okay.
So the next step in this process is that these guys are going to go and finalize the report that they've been talking about tonight. And that report will be available, so make sure that we have your contact information. You're here, so I suspect we have your contact information. But anyway, so they're going to do that, and it will be presented in another council workshop. And we will make that report available, and there will be more discussion on this. If you have specific comments, please send them to my office, and we will funnel that into the discussion process. So council has another meeting, and so they need this room. So if you guys, I will step out, and these guys will step out so we can continue individual conversation outside here. Again, thank you for taking your time. This, as you know, as you can tell, there is a big range of questions that we've got to wrestle with. No, no. Shannon, this is not an executive meeting. This is just a special meeting. It's not executive. So you're welcome to stay.
Correct.
Thank you, Mike. No, I knew that we were hitting time.